really good buddy of mine had recently purchased a home down in Southern California, and he called me up and he said, Chris, I've got these like 3 Orbi mesh devices that I bought from Costco. Is it going to be possible to use this to provide internet to my entire property? Now, the property that he purchased is like really, really nice, and it's a long lot that I don't think can be covered by those mesh devices. So I said, listen, there's really no way to really find out if those things are going to work until you actually try them. But my guess, my feeling, based on, the property and what I know of mesh devices, it's probably not going to work. And in addition, when you are going from hop to hop to hop with a mesh device, you're basically halving your bandwidth with every single hop. So by the time it gets to the back of the property, you're not going to have a very good experience with your internet. So I told him, look, why don't you let me design what I would do in the case of your property, as if you had hired me to design a network that will provide really good solid Wi-Fi to not only the buildings on the property, but also the outdoor sort of common areas as well. And he said he would absolutely love that. So that's what we're doing today. We are going to design a Wi-Fi network for a ranch home with a fairly good sized property. Okay, so ranch house point to multi-point, and this is sort of point to point or point to multi-point, and you guys will see what I did here. We ended up creating 3 different options. So we have a budget option, basically like just get decent Wi-Fi coverage to the entire property. Then option 2 is adding in a surveillance system. Let's also add in some cameras. And then option 3 is like, let's just blow out the budget and do like the craziest unified network that we possibly can. Okay, so project overview. We want to provide solid Wi-Fi to the main house. There's also a guest house on the property. There's also some common areas. There's also a chicken coop. So we're going to try to get Wi-Fi to everything. We want to avoid using the crappy Orbi mesh system, and it's actually this system right here. Again, this is a system that's made for a house, right? So basically you'd have all 3 of these antennas inside a single house. And it says it can go up to 7,500 square feet in a house. I mean, that's a humongous house. But this property, as you'll see in a second, is very far spread out. So while this should work in a single house, I'm not confident that this type of Orbi solution would work for this particular property, and we'll see why in just a second. The internet that they have is going to be 200 megabits per second, so totally fine. We don't need to really get gigabit all over the place as long as they've got good Wi-Fi, 100 megabit, 150 megabit, no matter where they are. I think that's perfectly acceptable for a residence. And then we want multiple options and also upgrade path, right? So you want upgradability, where maybe you're going to invest so much in the network now, but if you add a little bit more, then you are able to upgrade later to, for instance, add on a surveillance system or something like that. So let's take a look at the property itself. Now, as you can see here, this is a long lot, right? So it's a very odd shape. We've got the main house here up in the front of the yard. This next section here is a common area. It's like an outdoor kitchen area. By the way, this property is absolutely beautiful. Then we have a chicken coop area. So you got the chicken coop and then sort of this like outdoor sort of pavilion area. I don't know, maybe the previous owners let their chickens run around in this whole area. I really don't know. This grass here I think is AstroTurf. So this little section here is a little odd to me, but who knows what a previous owner did with a house. It still makes for an awesome like sort of party area. If you're cooking over here in the outdoor kitchen, got everyone hanging out over here in the sort of chicken coop yard. Yeah, it's really super cool. And then finally, at the very back of the property, we have a guest house. And it's a 2-story guest house. We want to provide good solid Wi-Fi to that as well as all of the outdoor areas and the main house. I'm not so concerned about providing Wi-Fi to the front yard. All right, so let's take a look at some views of the property. Here's the back of the house. Now, I'm going to be attaching some stuff here to the corner of the house. And I say I'm going to be attaching to the corner of the house. I'm not actually physically going to be attaching stuff to this house. In my design, this is where I would be placing the antennas and the access points. Of course, if you guys do want to see me risk catching COVID and fly down to Los Angeles to do an implementation of this property, put that down in the comments below if you have absolutely no regard for my safety. Okay, so here we have the outdoor kitchen. So this is sort of one of the common areas that we want to cover with Wi-Fi. Here is the outdoor kitchen area again that we just saw, but this gives us kind of a view down the property where we can see here, there's our chicken coop with the basketball hoop on the front. And then down here is the guest house. Now notice what we're seeing here. The line from the house, the main house to the guest house is this line right through here. So we have really nice line of sight. Now these trees are not going to be blocking the line of sight that much. We're going to be using 5 gigahertz antennas to make this connection, point to point or point to multipoint. You'll see in the different options here. And so I'm not concerned about tree cover at all. We can put an antenna right here and go straight through those trees, barely going to be any interference at all. So that's really, really nice. We have good, clear line of sight. Here's another view of the line of sight. So again, we're going right down the center of the property. We can put an antenna on this house right here or maybe right above this window, and it will have perfect line of sight over to the main house. A little bit of a closer look. So I mean, this kind of looks like there's trees in the way, but if you look at this view here, you can see that those trees shouldn't be much of an obstacle, especially at these distances. I mean, it won't be, you can make those things scream loud enough that they can get past this amount of tree cover. And then finally, here's looking back the other direction. So this is basically from the guest house looking towards the main house. You can see that the main house is perfectly clear. The only place where we maybe would be concerned about some trees are right here at the guest house. All right, so let's take a look at option number 1. Now, option number 1 is going to be our budget option, right? This is basically what's the least amount of money that we can spend to create a really good network that covers all of the areas of this property with solid Wi-Fi, not using mesh, right? Because when you use mesh, you're bound to have problems with not only going hop to hop and losing bandwidth along the way, but if those mesh routers are too far apart and they can't really hear each other, you're going to have spotty internet everywhere. So that's why mesh is not the best option for something like this. The better option is a point-to-point wireless bridge. Okay, so let's start from the main house. So here's the main house. We have the ISP's modem, and I don't know what, if it's Charter or Comcast or what, I have no idea. Doesn't matter to me. All I know is it's 200 megabit coaxial cable connection. And we're going to go with the UDM. That is the Ubiquity Dream Machine. Now, the UDM is going to provide your firewall. It has a 4-port switch, and it has a unified controller. It also has a 4x4 multi-user MIMO access point built in. I think it's 4x4. Let me double check that. Yes, 4x4 Wave 2 access point built in. So we're going to have that UDM, and the UDM is basically going to be able to provide the firewall as well as wireless to the inside of that house. It doesn't have any PoE though, right? So in order to get access to the other devices, and actually this is incorrect, we want to run a PoE injector. Now the PoE injector that we want to use is the PoE 24 watt gigabit PoE adapter, and it's about 16 bucks. But what that does is it gives us 24 volt passive PoE to power up this NanoBeam AC Gen 2, and it has 1 full amp of power as opposed to the normal PoE injectors, which only have half an amp of power. And the reason that we want 1 full amp of power is because, see, I show this wired to the UAP ACM, but that's actually not correct. This needs to wire to the NanoBeam AC Gen 2, the access point side of the point-to-point wireless bridge. And then this AC Gen 2, the NanoBeam AC Gen 2, has a PoE out port that can also power up the UAP ACM access point. The UAP ACM access point can be powered by either 802.3 AF or 24 volt passive PoE. So that means if we go 24 volt passive into the NanoBeam AC Gen 2 to power it up, we can then also do 24 volt passive out to the UAP ACM to power that up as well. And the 1 amp of power just means that we're going to have plenty of juice for both of those devices instead of maybe risking not having enough power for one or the other. And if we scroll back, I would put both of these devices basically on the corner of this house. What that means is the point-to-point wireless bridge is going to shoot straight down the property to the station side of the wireless bridge, whereas the UAP ACM is going to provide wireless coverage to basically this whole area, sort of, because we'll put it right here, and it'll cover all of this basically. halfway into the chicken coop, right? So this whole area will be covered with nice outdoor Wi-Fi. Then on the other side of the wireless bridge, here is our our station side antenna, and we're just going to power that up with a single PoE injector. And so we have that same 1 amp 24 volt PoE injector. That's going to power up the station side Nanobeam AC Gen 2, which then in turn powers up a second UAP ACM. And if we look at the property again, that's going to go right here. So we're going to have the receiving antenna picking up the signal right at the front of the guest house, and then the UAP ACM on the outside of this building should provide coverage for this part of the yard as well as the entire interior of the guest house. I have no doubt that it would be able to also sort of extend its coverage to, provide wireless internet to anyone inside that guest house. And of course, our next budget, like the next steps up in the budget, we're going to actually put separate access points in the guest house. But for the budget version of this setup should work just fine to cover the entire property. What's the cost? The cost for this budget setup, we're looking at the UDM at about $300. The 24 volt passive 1 amp PoE injectors are about $16 each. Let me hit update here because the price has changed. There we go. So $16 each on the PoE injectors. Then we have the 2 Nanobeams at about $89 each, and we have the UAP ACMs at about $87 each. All these prices, by the way, are from Amazon. I have links to all 3 different budgets worth of items down in the description below. Those, of course, are Amazon affiliate links. If you click on those links, it doesn't change your price at all, but it gets us a few bucks for the referral. So thank you for any referrals that we receive. All right, so total price for this setup, $680.34 versus the Orbi, which is $439 for something that we don't even know if it's going to work. In fact, I would assume that it wouldn't work with a property that is this spread out. So if you had 1 Orbi in the main house, 1 Orbi maybe in the chicken coop, and then 1 Orbi in the guest house, maybe they'd be able to talk to each other, but by the time you get to the guest house, it would probably have such low bandwidth and be totally spotty. I just would not want to spend money on a $439 solution that I wasn't 100% sure was going to work when I know that this solution will work great, and it's, about $250 more expensive than that Orbi solution. Okay, so that's our budget setup. Now, let's say we want to start throwing some more bucks into this thing, right? Maybe we want to add surveillance cameras all over the property as well, okay? So let's look at option number 2. Now, option number 2 is going to be your network plus surveillance cameras, and we're going to do this with sort of a medium-sized budget in mind. Okay, so here we go. Internet comes in. We're hitting a UDM Pro. So we have replaced the UDM, the Dream Machine, with a Dream Machine Pro. And that gives us Unify Protect capability. So we have a Unify controller, we have a firewall, we have an 8-port switch, we have the Unify Protect system built in. One thing that I didn't add into the cost, I just realized, was the cost of a hard drive for the UDM Pro. We would have to add one of those in. And then we're going to take that out to a US 8 150 watt switch. Why did we choose the US 8 150 watt switch? There's a very good reason for that. It is because the US 8 150 watt switch, the PoE ports can provide both 24 volt passive and 802.3 AF AT PoE, which means we are able to power up our access point, which in this case, we're going to use the UAP Flex HD since the UDM Pro does not have an access point built in. So we're going to go with the Flex HD just because it's a really nice form factor for a residence. You don't have to stick it on the ceiling anywhere. It can kind of just be off on a shelf somewhere, and you can kind of move it around without too much trouble. I really like this form factor for a residential home. We're also going to add in the UVC G4 doorbell, which I have this connected to the switch, but I don't actually think that is PoE powered. I think the doorbell gets its internet connection, its network connection over Wi-Fi, and then you just use your doorbell wires to power it up. So this is a little bit inaccurate, but you guys get the picture. And then we're going to have a 24 volt passive PoE out to the Nanobeam AC Gen 2, which also powers up the UAP ACM, same one that we used in the budget setup. To this setup, we are also going to add a UVC G4 bullet camera. This is going to be for the rear of the house, sort of watching the rear entry of the house and anyone coming up from the back of the house. Now, I didn't put a camera on the front of the house because I figured that the G4 doorbell would do that job. So you've got the G4 doorbell camera looking out the front of the house. You've got the G4 bullet camera looking at the back of the house for anyone approaching from that direction. Then we have our same wireless bridge, and I didn't fix this. So originally when I was designing this, I didn't fix this text here. It says Gigabeam or Nanobeam AC Gen 2. I originally thought, well, maybe you could use the Gigabeam for this deployment, right? The Gigabeam is a 60 gigahertz point-to-point antenna, so it's much higher speed than the Nanobeam AC Gen 2, and it also has a 5 gigahertz failover radio for, if there's bad weather or something like that. But in this case, there's actually a few downsides to using the Gigabeam. So number one downside is that the Gigabeam does not have a second network port, right? So you can't actually go out to the UAP ACM. You'd have to have a different solution for powering up the mesh access points on the exterior of the buildings. Number two, with the internet connection only being 200 megabits per second, you really don't need the extra bandwidth that the Gigabeam is going to provide. You're never going to use it, so it's not really an advantage. And number three, this is a residential home, and you've got 1 Gigabeam pointing at the main house from the other side of the property and 1 Gigabeam pointing at the guest house from the main house. Now that's 60 gigahertz connection where you're going to be blasting 60 gigahertz from both directions into the main house and into the guest house. And there are people who might be sensitive to the 60 gigahertz waves that are coming through the air, and you might actually experience headaches or something from that. So it is a close enough range that I just wouldn't want to chance having this in a residential setup. Now, if you had 2 Gigabeams on the top of a 5-story building pointing at each other from half a mile away, that's probably not such a big deal. But in a residential setting, I want to be cognizant of the fact that people might be able to pick up on those 60 gigahertz wavelengths. On the guest house here, we have the same PoE injector, but this time we're going out to a switch. And I chose the USW Lite 8 PoE, which is powering up 2 of the UVC G4 bullet cameras. Optionally, since this is a guest house, you might also want to add another UVC G4 doorbell if you ever think that someone's going to be coming up and hitting the doorbell in the guest house. But in this case, we're going to forget the doorbell on the guest house. We're going to use the USW Lite 8 PoE. And you might say, well, why are you using the USW Lite 8 PoE instead of the US 8 60-watt switch? They're the exact same price. They're $109 for either the US 8 60-watt or the USW Lite 8 PoE. They're both 8 ports. The difference is the US 8 60-watt switch only provides 802.3 AF PoE power, whereas this one provides 4 ports of 802.3 AF or AT power, or what's known as PoE plus power. So it's a newer generation. It has a little bit more power that it can output to its 4 PoE ports, so that's why I went with the USW Lite 8 PoE here. And same thing, we've got the UAP ACM. So let's take a look at this overview once more. If we look at the main house, we're going to have a UAP Flex HD providing Wi-Fi to the inside of the house. We're going to have a mesh Wi-Fi antenna providing, it's wired, it's a mesh antenna, but we're still going to have it wired, and it's going to be providing wireless basically to this outdoor area, the outdoor kitchen, and sort of into the chicken coop area. We're going to have the Nanobeam shooting internet across over to the guest house. And on the guest house, we're going to have the UAP ACM on the outside of the guest house, which is going to provide Wi-Fi to the yard as well as to the house itself. Then we'll have 1 G4 camera on the back and 1 G4 camera on the front. Over here, we're going to have 1 G4 camera looking out the back, and we have the doorbell providing surveillance for the front. So all in all, a really nice setup, a really nice Unify setup. And let's look at our pricing. Okay, so our pricing here comes out to just over $2,000 for this whole thing. Now, the only stuff I'm not counting in here, obviously I forgot to add the hard drive to the UDM, so that's another, $150, $180, something like that. And then I'm not counting on any of the wiring, certainly not counting any of the labor. This is just the equipment itself. But if you think $2,000 is just crazy expensive to be paying for this network, let's look at this. Where can you save a few bucks in this medium budget build? So first of all, you can change out all of the G4 Bullet cameras with the G3 Flex cameras, right? So you've got your G4 Bullet, looks like this. You've got your G3 Flex, looks like this. This is 79 bucks. This is 199 bucks. The difference is this one's higher quality image, and it's also much more weather resistant than the G4 Flex. The G4 Flex can technically be outside, but I would make sure you put it upside down and have it underneath the eave of the roof so that like rain wouldn't be sort of getting into like where the network connection goes. But you could save some bucks. You could save 120 bucks for each of those cameras by replacing out the G4 Bullet with the G3 Flex. The other thing you can do is at the guest house, you can choose to get rid of the switch entirely. So let's look at this. If you get rid of this switch entirely, you can basically just use PoE injectors and sort of daisy chain them together and power up the G4 Bullets. And in fact, that wouldn't cost you anything extra because the UAP ACMs come with PoE injectors that we're not using. So you have 2 spare PoE injectors with this setup that you could use to power the G4 Bullets. The disadvantage to doing that is that you are not upgradable, right? So if you wanted to add more devices wired into the guest house, if you wanted to add another camera, if you wanted to add an interior access point to the guest house, you need a switch for that, right? So by having the US Lite 8 PoE, you're providing yourself some upgradability, some future expandability. But you don't absolutely need it. If you wanted to shave off 109 bucks, you can basically remove that entirely and then just daisy chain 3 PoE injectors instead. So if you did those 2 things, the price would actually come down to about 1,560 bucks instead of the 2,028 of everything else here. Okay, there's our medium budget build. Let's now blow the budget out of the water, okay? So if we want to do our just go for it, man, our big budget build, this is what we're going to do. We're going to stick with the UDM Pro. We're going to have our US 8 150 watt switch, just like we did before. We're going to have our UVC G4 doorbell, but we're also going to add a G4 Bullet camera to the front of the house. So the doorbell might not get a full picture of the front yard, might not get the full picture that we want. Maybe we want to put another camera on the front of the house, sort of on the corner, you know, covering the side of the house a little bit more, maybe where there's some obstructed views that the doorbell can't see. We're going to stick with our UAP Flex HD. We're also going to have the same UAP ACM on the outside patio, but notice this is connected now directly to the US 8 150 watt switch. We're still going to have our backyard G4 Bullet camera, but instead of the Nano Beam AC Gen 2 point-to-point, we're now going to go point to multi-point, okay? So we're going to add a point right in the center of the yard. So we're going to use the Air Max Light AP AC. I absolutely love this access point. It's one of my favorites. And we're going to shoot over to, first, the chicken coop. So we're going to use a Nano Beam AC Gen 2 to pick up the signal from the chicken coop. If you look at the pictures, we can basically put it right here, or, you know, on the corner of the chicken coop, and we can grab the connection from the main house. We'll also have one back here, but this is point to multi-point. So we're going to have one antenna picking up internet here that can be wired inside the chicken coop, or you can use it, in this case, as a UAP ACM outside the chicken coop. We're also going to add a G4 Bullet camera over there, right? So there we have a camera, surveillance, mid-yard surveillance, as well as an extra outdoor access point. So if we look at the property overview, we now have a UAP ACM here providing coverage to the outdoor kitchen. We'd have one on the chicken coop providing coverage to this area, and then we'd still have one on the guest house providing coverage to the front yard of the guest house. And of course, you'd want to dial those in so that they're, maybe lower down the output strength and then change the channels so that they're not overlapping and do all that sort of good stuff. But you could have basically an extra point right here at the chicken coop with just to really hammer home the Wi-Fi. Okay, so now let's look at the guest house. The guest house, we're doing the same sort of stuff, except we're adding a camera to the front and rear. We're putting in that US Lite 8 PoE switch, USW Lite 8 PoE, and then we're going to add a Flex HD access point inside the house. Again, just to really drive home the good Wi-Fi. Okay, so we're going to put a separate access point inside the guest house. We're going to have the Oh, I take that back. I got rid of the UAP ACM. So the Flex HD here, let's go back and look at our property overview. So we'll have a UAP ACM here, which should cover the whole front yards here, and then we'll have the Guest House Flex HD inside the house, which will cover the guest house and probably cover a good chunk of the front and backyard of the guest house as well. So there we go. That is that build, and yeah, that's blowing out the budget though. So $2,710.98 to go with this full setup with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 surveillance cameras, an access point inside each of the main houses, a point to multi-point network, and then 2 separate outdoor access points to cover the yard. That is an awesome setup. I really like that. Now, instead of talking about, well, where can we save a few bucks in the big budget build? Let's not do that. Let's say, where can we spend even more money if we wanted to, right? So let's talk about that for a second. So, if we upgrade the main house, we can give ourselves a little bit more expandability by upgrading this US 8 150 watt switch to a 16 port version of the same one. Now we want to go with the Gen 1 switch because the Gen 1 switch can do either 802.3 AF or 24 volt passive on each of the ports. And since we have a mixture of 24 volt and 802.3 AF devices, that'll provide power to absolutely everything. And right now we're going to be using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 8 of the ports in the US 8 150 watts. So we can expand that a little bit, put in the 16 port switch. It gives us a little bit of future proofing. Now we can also get rid of the UDM Pro and the UAP Flex HD access point, swap it out for a UDM and then a UNVR plus hard drives. So basically we're saying, let's get rid of this UDM Pro and let's get rid of this Flex HD. We're going to put a UDM, a standard Dream Machine, which has the access point built in, but it doesn't have Protect. It doesn't have the surveillance stuff. And we're going to put in the UNVR. I've got one right here. You guys can see it right here. So this is the UNVR. It can have 4 hard drives worth of surveillance footage, right? So it's redundant, but it's much more expensive, right? So it's $399 for the UNVR. Then you got to add hard drives into it. I put 4 8 terabyte hard drives in mine, and it cost me close to $1,000 to do that, right? So all in all, you'd be looking at adding $1,240 to the price of the build by getting rid of the UDM Pro and the Flex HD, adding in a UDM and the UNVR instead. Then, what if we upgraded all the cameras to the G4 Pro 4K cameras, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those. Upgrade them all to those cameras, which I think are $449 a piece. Regardless, it would be a $1,250 upgrade to do that. Now, we could also replace the chicken coop PoE injectors. So instead of having this sort of ragtag daisy-chained PoE setup, why don't we toss another USW Lite 8 PoE over here, and then we can have a little bit more expandability. Actually, what we would want there is the US 8 150 watt. Is that what I said? Yeah, the US 8 150 watt, because again, here at the chicken coop, we have a 24 volt passive device, we have a 802.3 AF device, so when you have a mixture of those, you want a switch that can do both types of power. And then finally, we can upgrade both of the UAP ACMs to UAP ACM Pros. That's our mesh access point on the main house and our mesh access point on the chicken coop. Let's just upgrade to the Pro version of the mesh access points. Gets us a little bit of a stronger signal, but really not much more advantage than that. But listen, if we're looking to blow out the budget, let's actually blow out the budget. And that would add, the total project with these changes would be $5,620 for that full setup. And wow, that would be an amazing network, but it would also be complete overkill. You don't need to do all that. Okay, so there you have it. There's our ranch network covering the main house, outdoor kitchen, chicken coop area, and guest house in 3 different flavors of budget. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you got a lot out of it. All of the links to all of these different budgets, all of the stuff that I used for this build, down in the description below if you guys want to check those out. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please click subscribe. My name's Chris with Crosstalk Solutions, and thank you so much for watching.